Welcome back to Weekend Express. My name is Dennis. Set on set, I have Kungu, Partnerships Manager from CFK Kenya and Africa, as we continue to have these conversations on 16 days of activism, what this means, especially in that theme that states that they need to end violence against women and girls. And before we went for the break, we were talking about the entire system, how they should come together. But it's clear that the justice system doesn't seem to be working. I'll give you an example where a few weeks ago, we were forced to tie someone who was being violent to the wife. And we were forced to tie them up because they were violent to the wife and also to us who were trying to stop that. We took them to a police station, but within 2-3 days, the man was out. And you see, this is a question. And when he got out, he moved houses, so there's no way to track them. There is no way to know whether the wife is safe or whatever. But how do we then sit down and have this conversation with powers that be in making sure that if someone is arrested, they go through the entire justice system, they are prosecuted, and they get to serve time?
So I would say all that just comes down to goodwill. Honestly, I continuously say this, Kenya has all the policies and all the laws that we will ever need at this point. I cannot imagine, especially around this topic around violence, that there is a policy that lacks. Policies exist. The only problem we have is implementation. And the reason why implementation is an issue is because we also don't have that goodwill. Because there has to be someone who finally says, within our legal system, within the justice system, and says that I will ensure that this happens. Within the police system, we'll ensure that this happens. And also now we need to move away from viewing gender-based violence only as a women's issue, but a community issue. Because what happens is there are costs that come with violence after it happens. Not only to the woman, not only to the man, because men also are experiencing violence, but to society as well, to the health system. So what happens is, after going through such levels of violence, trauma steps in. And trauma has a lot of ripple effects on one's mental health. And this really can limit their level of exercising all their other activities in life. So you can get to the point where you're so traumatized that they no longer want to go to school because they're constantly afraid that I will get attacked again. So now let's take it especially from a perspective of sexual violence, where if a girl is violated when she was randomly going to school, from that day on, more likely than not, every single trip that means her leaving the house to go to school progress. So if there were any issues around psychosocial support that the family sought, there's a cost associated to that. There's a cost to the health of it. If a woman also is getting a lot of physical violence within the household, it limits also her economic activities. So now what you're realizing is, as on top of the cost of taking care of her, there's the loss that the family will experience. She's no longer as emotionally available to the family or her children as she would be. She's no longer able to partake in her economic activities as productively as she would be. So overall, beyond issues of legal, we also need to be cognizant of the cost implications of gender-based violence. And it's not just the women and the girls or any survivor who suffers this, it's all of us as a whole, it's society as a whole. Because you could be losing out on a really brilliant person because literally that trauma has disabled them. So what would we do to mitigate against that? Now, one of the things I also like to mention when it comes to issues of gender-based violence is that we also need to be cognizant of, I was talking a lot about trauma and basically how trauma is a tool of control. So what happens is when you go through that violence, it could be either it's a one-off instance, it could be a methodical process, because basically it's not all trauma that is violent. It's not the all instances where someone grabs you today on the road or somewhere, violates you. Sometimes it's systematic. It's something what you call trauma bonding, where basically they are consistently building you up and then breaking you down, building you up and then breaking you down, so that you bond to them and you require so much validation that you cannot see your existence outside of that person. And what that happens is now they really now get the real violence, the real control. Because for gender-based violence, it doesn't have to be just physical violence. Control also is violence. Because what you're doing is you are taking away my autonomy or the survivor's autonomy, so that you basically exist within the realm of the reality that your abuser believes you should exist. And this is also now why, as we are going through 16 days of activism, is that there's a lot of talk around issues of sexual and physical violence. But also let's talk a lot around issues of mental and emotional violence, which is really especially rampant among households, and especially between intimate partners. These are couples.
And I think when you're talking about the mental aspect of gender-based violence, comes to a point where once someone has gone through this process, it is an internal thing. They live through it for the entire time they are on the face of the earth. And access to psychosocial support is not cheap. It is not cheap. And also just awareness about it isn't there. So how then do we have a conversation around, we have gender-based violence, there is trauma associated with it, and this is what we need to do to help this survivor?
Now, when it comes to mental health, there's a lot of barriers to it. Number one, as you said, there's issues of cost. On average, it's about 5,000 per session for you to get one-on-one therapy sessions. And you probably need about 10 or so, not to heal, because you never heal from trauma. The only thing you do by going through psychosocial support is to get the skills or the tools to cope with it, because trauma is always triggered at some point. Something will happen and it will trigger your trauma, but if you have learned certain skills that psychosocial support, especially through a trained profession, gives you, allows you to be able to activate those coping skills, and you're able to bounce back and recover and then move forward, because it's a continuous process. I've worked quite a bit with a lot of survivors of violence, and you realize that 10 years later, you still get triggers. So number one is the cost of the mental health services that are available. Number two also is also the African perception on mental health services. Because number one, it's either you are psychotic, there's nothing else after that. So, but you realize stress is also a form of mental health. Anxiety is a form of mental health. And those can be supported through therapy. And due to also a lot of our cultural biases on how we view that, oftentimes we are prescribed to go for prayer. Prayer is important. Prayer is essential. It nourishes the soul. But all the same also, it is good to go and get the support to unpack, to get to the point where you accept where you're at in life and get the skills to cope. So mental health essential, but also those two barriers really need to be addressed. And you can imagine it's even worse, especially in disadvantaged communities. For example, where CFK Africa works, we work in informal settlements. It's really hard to tell a woman who is earning on average an income of maybe 170 shillings a day to go for therapy for 5,000, and she needs like 10 sessions of those. So how do we ensure that we provide these services? Government has done quite a lot, especially under the Ministry of Health, in trying to support that. And also we have what we call GVRC centers. But the gap that I feel really is within those also free services that are available is the extent as to how long those sessions should be. Because on average, people access 2 to 3 sessions only. And actually, of all the services that are in the minimum pack for GBV, mental health is the least accessed of all the services. So people are not really accessing it. So we also need to rethink how we are providing these services to these women, to these survivors, men, women, all of them, how we are providing these services to them. There needs to be an intentional process of designing it. As an organization, we actually took up such a process where you're trying to see how you can custom make psychosocial support for survivors depending on where they're at in terms of especially issues of age. I'll take an example of children. So when it comes to supporting children through mental health, even just the process of disclosing what happened and who it is, even if they know clearly 100% it is you, it is a process for them. Children require a lot of time to disclose. And so for that to happen, it is not an issue of sitting them down and grilling them, because what you're doing is you're just re-traumatizing them. So things like art therapy really works with them, because a child is doing something fun, but they're also not cognizant that they are opening up to you. So that helps a lot. Color therapy, all that, it helps children open up. So that needs to be something that we're thinking through. So for example, for us, we did do quite a bit of that. We designed a model that supports 15 to 30-year-olds, where there's a lot of issues of dance and yoga, so that you feel comfortable. Basically, how do we nourish self before we start healing the trauma? And what you realize is with most of these government facilities, number one, there is no space for that kind of service to be provided. Issues of skill also is a bit of a gap, where they have the basics where you can provide therapy or counseling, but for you to be able to provide, for example, that kind of specialized art therapy session to a child, there's some additional training that's needed, which is not really available. There are additional supplies. There has to be quite a lot of art supplies. It has to be a room that is exciting and appealing to a child, and that is something that's not available. So how do we also ensure that we are able, yes, the government is willing and ready to provide the free services, but how also do we make the services quality, and it fits the need of the person at that point. So quality also now becomes another issue for where they can get free services.
Now let's talk about, as we talk about gender-based violence, and especially 16 Days of Activism ending violence against women and girls, we have to bring the other gender into play. We have to bring men into these conversations. In terms of, as a man, what is your responsibility to your daughter, to your wife, to your neighbor? What is your responsibility as a man in regards to making sure that women folk, that girl child enjoys the same access to facilities, the rights that you enjoy as a man? So how do we then bring men on board and make them be champions of 16 Days of Activism and ending these vices?
So male involvement is really critical in all issues across women and girls and issues of gender inequality. Now, number one, we must be cognizant, as I've said, men and women, boys and girls, all experience gender-based violence. However, it happens more with women and girls than men. And sadly, men make up 85% of the perpetrators. So what now happens to men who are not the perpetrators and who want to shield their communities? So the most important thing is, number one, is to shift the mindset that gender-based violence is an issue of women, but it is an issue of all of us. Number two also is to shift the mindset when it comes to issues of power and control. So we are socialized to have different roles, and also how you act depending on your gender, because that's what's expected. So for women, we are more often than not perceived to be the weaker ones, and men are perceived to be the strong ones, you know, the ones in charge. So even so even as you're growing up, the boys are always told, you know, don't show weakness, be in control, you should always be in control. Now, herein is a problem where you need to support a lot of men to unlearn that control is not what defines manhood. And I probably may not be the best person to speak about being a man, because I'm not one. But issues of control and power are really pertinent, because until we unlearn that, it becomes a problem. Because basically gender-based violence, it is literally just a symptom of gender inequalities. So if we can get more men to start viewing women the same way most of them, and I say this most because perpetrators also often come from families, for the way most men view with care and affection towards their mothers, especially their sisters and their daughters, if you could reflect that same kind of affection and care to every other woman, we would make miles in reducing those cases. Because basically what we just need is for women to be viewed as human beings. That's it. Just view them as human beings. They are not a way for you to assert your control. They are not a way for you to get some assurance that you're in charge. They are just human beings like everyone else. And we could all just be investing our energies in far more productive things without having also the power play. So yes, men can be allies, and we have a lot of men also in our society that are allies and that are supporting women. We just need more of those, and we just also need to, as I've said, to just unlearn a lot of the social beliefs on what manhood is, on what the dynamics of a man and a woman kind of relationship should be, because those are what bring up the issues in the end. Because now you're trying to reassert or repossess the role that you are told predominantly is yours.
And you see, you bring up a very important aspect, because there's something that happens a lot, and as a man I loathe on it, the issue of catcalling. It's considered as an issue of gender-based violence. You walk around and it seems like any other, not any other, but a set of matatu touts. It's okay for them to grab a woman and push them, shove them around as they want. But now, how do we then bring the entire society together as men to know that if I see this, I call it out? Because another problem we have is these issues are not called out. They've been allowed to pass, and it becomes a normal thing to see. As a man who has a wife, sister, nieces out here, and have a mother, how do I send this love from being personal and make it personal with the entire society, that is the women folk out there? How do you have this conversation with men?
Calling out, you've said specifically what it is. We just need more men to call out their fellow men. Because I can assure you, there is no woman in God's green earth who considers catcalling a compliment. And sadly, that's what most people think. They think it's a compliment, and it's not. It's demeaning. It really does feel demeaning, and it is demeaning, because basically what you're doing is you are objectifying someone. If truly and honestly you admire a lady when you see her, walk up to her and talk to her decently. Why don't men catcall fellow men? Because obviously you do see a man pass by the road and you're like, I like what he does. You know, why don't men catcall each other out? Because does that mean you see nothing good in other men? You do, but you don't catcall them. No, you'll have that respect, you know, to walk up to him like, boss, I like what you're doing, you know.
Yeah.
But for us, you must be called, and the minute you don't respond to it positively, then you must have repercussions to it. You must be punished for it. So conversations, how we have that, especially in our context, I'd say as an organization, is we have a lot of men-only conversations where we have sessions to really just create awareness between men on how certain behaviors reflect. And another thing also is we focus a lot on younger boys, because what you realize is when you are an older man past a certain age, the much you can do is to support you to unlearn. But for the younger boys, they are still at a point where you can mold. So if you get men that can be able to be good role models to them, to guide them, then it reshifts and builds a generation of men that have a different perspective. Men who are able, for example, to stand up and argue and support and be allies towards women issues. So interesting things we do also with such young boys is, for example, if you're having conversations on menstrual hygiene, periods, as since most people are shy to say it, it's just periods. So you have sessions where you're bringing boys.
Some are afraid to even buy sanitary towels for their significant others.
So we will have these sessions, and we let the boys also come in. Let the boys also come and touch a pad, touch a tampon. Let them know these are normal things that a girl goes through as she's developing. The same way you as a boy, you have your own things that you're going through. Your shoulders are broadening. You're growing hair in different parts. It's normal. We all go through it. So how you really can be able to support in the future is reshape the boys at an early age. Involve them. Let this conversation not be boys or girls conversation. It's developmental conversation, so that as you're growing up, you will realize that there's nothing that different from the girls from us. We have a slightly different path, but all in all, we are all actually just going in the same direction. So a lot of reshaping of mindsets becomes very critical.
And finally, how do you deal with the culture that we have as an African society? Because it is through the culture that you're told, as a man, you're supposed to be macho. You're not supposed to even share emotions. You're supposed to be like a wall and agree. And you find through such instances, men don't know how to deal with their emotions. A lot of men out here are emotional wrecks, and they tend to transfer that damage to women who they consider to be the weaker subjects. So finally, in 2 minutes, just talk to a man out there what they need to do, and parents and societies on the need of just bringing up proper people.
I would say, let me first mostly focus on parents. I would encourage you to really reconsider what and how you communicate to your child. So when children are really young, how they relate to you as a parent determines how they will be bonding with everyone else moving forward. So if it is from a point of intimidation, and that is how they perceive affection is, you're making your child a target for abuse, because they will only resonate that some form of fear, some form of control is the evidence of love, because they've grown up knowing that. And the reason why children do that is because, of all things, the one relationship we could never walk away from is our parents. So you could never walk away from your parent, and you're a child, you don't have any other option. So you believe that that is how love is given. So also, if you are bringing up your child from a point of control also, there are those ones who perceive it the other way, that if you love someone, you must control them. So they take it at different points. So this is why we really have to be careful when we are parenting, when we're being around our kids, and how we behave and what we communicate and how we communicate, because basically you're training them for the future on how they will be parents themselves. For society, I would say this: our culture is beautiful. We have a lot of beautiful things about our different culture, the different tribes we have in Kenya. However, also there are things that we need to be accepting that are harmful to society, and we need to let go of those, because honestly right now as a community, the only way we will progress in this country is it's a joint effort. We know the situation that COVID set us back with, economically, socially. How can we progress if you have a whole gender that is basically having to deal with their emotions and trauma? You literally, that becomes your work instead of being productive. So how do we get that aspect of our mindset shifted? And we need also to involve more community leaders in all our efforts. All these community leaders are the ones that basically will allow communities to feel comfortable to reshape. It's the same thing with FGM. When we involved the elders, then there was a significant shift in that perception. And for the men, the only thing I always say is, consider that every other woman you meet on the road is the same to that woman. Is it your mother, your sister, your daughter that you really love? You know, the ones that you would go to war for. Transfer at least, even if it's a portion of that kind of affection, to other women as well. And it's welcome affection. And affection, I mean just care.
Yeah.
So that you also feel that they need to be protected, similar to how you would want your person protected.
I don't think I have anything else to add. It is our sole responsibility as a society to come together in ensuring that both men and women are equal and that we enjoy the same rights in this country. My name is Dennis. I sat on set ahead and Kungu from CPF Africa. Karibu sana, and all the best in your good job that you do. I'll see you in a bit for News Center at 11 a.m.